You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. Today, episode 111, Retreat from Lake Champlain. Last week, we left General Benedict Arnold's fleet bottled up in Valcour Bay. The Americans had done great damage despite being no match for the British in numbers of ships, guns, or men. They had fought the fleet to a draw that day, but the Americans could not count on luck to continue. While General Carleton had used up the entire summer building his fleet, he did so in order to make it virtually impossible for any American fleet to defeat him. Despite British shortcomings that day, their preparations in building such an overwhelming fleet meant that they would inevitably win the battle and control the lake. After dark, on October 11, 1776, British General Guy Carleton, aboard the flagship Maria, sent his first reports of the battle back to Quebec to be forwarded on to London. Carleton ignored his own apparent missteps, not knowing where the enemy was despite an intelligence warning that they were in the area, not distributing any plan of attack to his captains, spreading out his fleet along the lake so that they were not prepared for battle when they encountered the enemy, and allowing his flagship to stay out of the battle. Instead, he simply reported that he had bottled up the enemy in Valcour Bay, making an escape impossible. Despite the fact that the day went according to Arnold's plans, not Carleton's, the British commander was confident that the next day would be the end of the American fleet. On that first day, the Americans had taken the British ship Carleton out of commission, but overall the British had only lost about 40 of their 2,500 men in the fleet, killed or wounded. Carleton had sufficient reserves to rearm his smaller gunboats and would have his entire fleet in place the following morning to resume the attack. General Carleton planned either to accept the surrender of Arnold's fleet or destroy it in the morning. This was not an unreasonable expectation. The Continentals had lost the Royal Savage, lighting up the night as it burned down to its waterline. All of their other ships had also taken damage. Overall, the Americans had lost about 60 of their 500 men killed or wounded aboard all ships. Many had lost their officers to Indian sharpshooters or lucky cannonballs. Most were taking on water, some at alarming rates. The sailing vessels had their sails and rigging damaged, thus impeding their speed in any escape attempt. As usual, the Continentals were low on ammunition. During the battle on the first day, they had used up about 75% of their total ammunition. They could not keep up the same rate of fire for another day. Meanwhile, the British had moved up their larger ships that had sat out the fighting on the first day. On the second day of fighting, they were prepared to direct even more firepower with larger guns on the small American fleet. Despite all these problems, General Arnold was in a good mood. He praised the work of his officers and men for their fighting that day and congratulated them on holding back the superior British fleet. His praise included Captain Hawley of the Royal Savage, who had made his way from his sunken ship back to the fleet. Arnold gave Hawley the command of the Washington, whose captain was too wounded to command the following day. The Americans had inflicted a great deal of damage on the British ships, despite having a crew about 1/5 the size of the enemy, half the number of ships, fewer and smaller cannon, and sailors with almost no combat experience, many without even experience at sea. Yet, even with their good work on that first day, they remained trapped in Valcour Bay. The British fleet blocked passage to the south, rocks and debris blocked escape to the north, and hundreds of Indians along the shore prevented any escape overland. While Carleton anticipated his final victory over the American fleet, Arnold revealed his escape plan to his Continental officers. Now, General Carleton had organized his fleet at the mouth of the bay, the only realistic escape route for the Americans. When Arnold met with his officers on the night of October 11, 1776, he needed a plan to get his men, and hopefully his ships, past the British fleet to sail back to Fort Ticonderoga, where the main force of Continentals prepared to meet the British fleet. General Arnold was nothing if not daring. He informed his officers that they would sail their ships right through the British fleet that night. Arnold ordered the captain of each ship to tie a lantern made out of tin so that it only emitted a tiny sliver of light, which would shine on a line of chalk drawn onto the stern of each boat. The lit-up chalk line could only be seen for about 50 feet by someone directly behind the boat. This would serve as a guide for each boat to follow the one in front of it as they passed through the enemy fleet. It certainly was a risky scheme, but amazingly it worked. That evening, after dark, the American ships slowly moved through the enemy lines. The sailing vessels had only one small sail up so that they would drift slowly through the fleet. The row galleys would use muffled oars so that the enemy could not hear them. By some accounts, they passed so close to the British flagship Maria that sailors reported hearing the officers laughing in their cabin as they discussed plans for the following day. The weather apparently also cooperated by providing a fog that made it difficult to see much of anything in the dark. If any British were aware of another ship drifting nearby, they must have assumed it was one of their own fleet. There's no evidence that any British watchman challenged any of the American ships. Later, other officers critical of Carleton blamed Arnold's escape on Carleton's orders to pull back several ships away from the mouth of the bay, giving the Americans the space they needed to pass through. At dawn on October 12th, the British were amazed to find the American fleet had vanished. Carleton first assumed that the Americans had somehow escaped to the north, going through the difficult waters at the northern tip of Valcour Island. He immediately ordered his fleet to move north to intercept the Americans before they could attack any targets in the British rear. Carleton was so stunned and moved so quickly that he forgot to give any orders to the soldiers he had put ashore that night in the expectation that they would be boarding the American fleet in the morning. Although the Americans were only a few miles to the south, the morning fog prevented the British lookouts from discovering their position. It took Carleton till about noon that day to realize he was moving in the wrong direction. By midday, the fog had lifted. British lookouts spotted sails miles to the south on the lake and moving further south. By the time Carleton got his fleet turned around, he only made it back as far as Valcour Island by nightfall. So he ended up spending a second night in almost the same spot as the previous night. General Arnold, however, was not in the clear yet. While Carleton was sailing north in search of Arnold's fleet, the Americans had to spend most of the morning of October 12th repairing their ships to the point where they could remain afloat and on the move. Arnold scuttled 3 of his most badly damaged gondolas, the Providence, the New York, and the New Jersey. He sent his fastest ship, the Liberty, down the lake as fast as it could go. It would deliver dispatches to Crown Point and Ticonderoga that the British fleet was on its way and could not be stopped. He also begged for any reinforcements that the forts could send. The Liberty also carried away the wounded from the battle. Late on the day of October 12th, after spending the previous day in battle, the previous night escaping the British fleet, and then most of that day repairing and sailing his ships, Arnold planned for yet another sleepless night sailing his fleet further south on another dangerous nighttime naval movement to escape the British. But this time, nature turned out to be not on his side. Unfavorable winds, tired rowers, and damaged ships still taking on water allowed the American fleet to sail only 12 miles that night. The following morning, the weather cleared and the British had the American fleet still in view. Arnold's men were sailing against a southerly wind, meaning they made little progress. Meanwhile, the British caught a northerly wind and were sailing speedily toward the American fleet. Arnold knew it would be only a matter of hours before the British caught up to his fleet. He ordered his 5 fastest ships to speed ahead and attempt to make their escape. Arnold would stay behind aboard the Congress, which would remain with the badly damaged Washington and 4 smaller gunboats to engage the enemy and slow their progress. When the British got within 5 miles of his fleet, Arnold finally picked up the northern wind that had been giving the advantage to the British all morning. But even with a favorable wind, their tattered sails prevented them from moving as fast as the British. Eventually, the British Inflexible caught up with the Washington, which had been taking on water and moving slower than the other ships. After receiving only a few shots, Captain Hawley struck his colors and surrendered. Only 16 men from the crew escaped in a small boat. The rest of the crew of 122 surrendered. Hawley had always been at a disadvantage with his heavily damaged ship. On top of that, the Inflexible's guns had a much longer range and could fire on the Washington without getting in range of the Washington's guns. Even so, Captain Hawley, who had commanded the Royal Savage 2 days earlier, had the distinction of surrendering 2 ships in one battle without firing a shot. With the Washington out of the fight, the British could focus all their attention on Arnold's Congress and the 4 smaller gunships. While making repairs on the 12th, Arnold had prepared for this possibility. He had mounted his largest cannons on the rear of each ship so that they could fire on the enemy as it gained on them. Arnold also reached his location of choice for battle, a narrow area known as Split Rock that provided the greatest difficulty for the British to maneuver their ships. Arnold's diminished fleet continued its running firefight with the British for nearly 5 hours. Arnold personally aimed the cannon out of the windows of his cabin in the stern of the Congress. His small fleet continued to use its rear cannons effectively to smash at the British ships. The British, of course, returned fire and inflicted more casualties and damage on the Americans. By late afternoon, the 7 large British warships had surrounded what remained of the American fleet and continued to blast away at them even more effectively with their broadsides. 27 of Arnold's remaining 70 officers and crew were killed or seriously wounded. Not only were Arnold's remaining ships badly damaged, they were also almost entirely out of ammunition. But General Arnold was not a surrender kind of guy. He still had one more card to play. Arnold had carefully mapped out Lake Champlain during the year that he controlled it. He knew that nearby Buttonmold Bay was deep enough for his small ships, but too shallow for the larger British ships to follow. Arnold steered his fleet into Buttonmold Bay and grounded his ships along the shore, grounding his ship, the Congress, last. He ordered the ships not to strike their colors, but to set them on fire with the flag still flying. He would not surrender his ships, but he sure as heck was going to deny them to the enemy. Arnold ordered his Marines to take positions along the shore and fire at the British longboats that were attempting to board his grounded ships. Then another event happened that would haunt Arnold's reputation. Arnold had ordered the wounded removed from the ships and for the crew to blow up the ships in order to deny them to the enemy. In the confusion, a Lieutenant Goldsmith, who was suffering from a serious leg wound, got left aboard one of the ships. Just before the ship exploded, he called out for help. No one, however, was willing to risk their life to reboard the ship. As it exploded, both Americans and British watched Goldsmith's body get blown into the air and fall to the earth dead. Both British officers and some of Arnold's enemies within the Continental Army circulated the story that Arnold had ordered the ships blown up with the wounded still aboard. Arnold, of course, had ordered no such thing. When he found out what had happened, he threatened to run through the crewmen who had been tasked with helping Goldsmith off the ship. The only thing that may have stopped Arnold from going through with his threat was that a British artillery assault on his position forced everyone to scatter. Aided by locals and taking a little-known trail, Arnold and his men spent a third sleepless night carrying their wounded in slings made out of the remnants of ship's sails 20 miles back to Crown Point. They successfully avoided the Indian patrols looking for them and arrived at Crown Point early on October 14th, only hours ahead of the first British landing parties. Arnold still could not rest, though. He ordered all buildings burned along with any supplies they could not carry in order to deny Crown Point to the enemy. From there, his men continued on foot to Fort Ticonderoga. While some of Carleton's forces arrived that same day, Carleton himself apparently spent several days on the lake, not arriving at Crown Point until October 20th, nearly a week after Arnold had come and gone. British troops occupied the ruins, sleeping in tents as an early snow covered them. For the next 2 weeks, Arnold and the Continentals prepared for the British assault on Fort Ticonderoga. The small force waited for the attack to come, and then waited some more. Finally, after sending reconnaissance to Crown Point, Arnold discovered the British had left. General Carleton had remained at Crown Point until November 1st, trying to decide on his next steps. Although he had destroyed Arnold's fleet and still had his own fleet in relatively good shape, the winter weather convinced him that it was the wrong time to attack Ticonderoga. The fort's defenses would almost certainly require a lengthy siege. If the fleet remained in open water when it froze, the British would be trapped there. Even though they controlled the lake, supplying a siege force from their main base in Canada over the winter across a frozen lake would be extremely difficult. Having cleared the American fleet from Lake Champlain, Carleton could easily sail back in the spring and begin his siege then. So the 1776 fighting season ended with the Americans having lost control of Lake Champlain, but still in control of Fort Ticonderoga. Many historians have credited Arnold's loss at Valcour Bay as a success. He prevented the British from moving down the Hudson River that year as planned, and then connecting up with the main force in New York City and cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies. It is true that the British failed in that goal, but the fighting at Valcour Bay really did not contribute much to the British failure. Had Arnold scuttled his fleet at the first sign of British movement, it probably would have only allowed them to arrive at Ticonderoga a few days sooner. Rather than the fight itself, it was Arnold's efforts in building his fleet on Lake Champlain in the first place that made the difference. The mere existence of his fleet forced Carleton to spend all summer building an even bigger fleet. That was the delay that prevented Carleton from making any further progress that year. Most of Carleton's officers seemed to support his decision to return to Canada for the winter. Leaving his army exposed in New York surrounding Fort Ticonderoga would have left many dead from exposure, if nothing else. But the retreat back to Canada did not go over well in London. Lord Germain was deeply disappointed in Carleton's lack of progress and would eventually push aside Carleton for command of the following year's offensive. It did not help that over the winter, General Burgoyne returned to London and told everyone who would listen that Carleton was far too cautious and timid. If he had simply let Burgoyne attack when he wanted, this whole campaign would have been over long ago. Similarly, Arnold got mixed reviews for his efforts. Most top officers admired Arnold's ability to take the fight against a superior force and for his ability to keep the British in Canada from moving down into New York that year. Similarly, Arnold's popularity among the people seemed secure as one of the few fighting generals who fought gallantly. But many in the Continental Congress were less impressed. The politicians were hearing stories from all the junior officers who hated Arnold and who said everything they could to detract from his efforts. While Arnold had spent the summer and fall building his fleet and fighting the British, men like Colonel Easton and Major Brown spent months in Philadelphia doing everything they could to disparage Arnold. The fact that Arnold had lost at Quebec, then lost Canada, and now lost Lake Champlain did not exactly make for a winning general, despite the good excuse of being outmanned and outgunned at every step. In late November, after it became clear that Carleton was really gone for the winter and that his withdrawal was not some sort of ruse, Arnold decided to return home to Connecticut for the first time in a year and a half. Before doing so, he returned to Albany to meet with Generals Schuyler and Gates. There, Arnold decided that instead of going home, he should probably go to Philadelphia and attempt to clear up all the stories about him being told to members of Congress. But unable to stay away from battle, Arnold ultimately accompanied Gates and some of the forces from Fort Ticonderoga, and instead of going to Philadelphia, he met up with General Washington in New Jersey. Fort Ticonderoga remained under the command of Generals Gates and Schuyler. Both men, however, remained in Albany. Direct command of the fort fell to lesser officers, simply holding it as winter quarters. Next week, we return to the fighting in the South, where General Howe slowly but surely pushes General Washington's army out of New York. Hi, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show. I want to thank everyone who has supported the show, either by helping to spread the word, posting positive reviews, or financially. Patreon supporters have been a really big help in covering my expenses as the podcast grows. Roger Williams, who supports the show at the Privy Council level, runs 10crucialdays.org. His site is focused on the 10 crucial days following Washington's crossing of the Delaware, when things really turned around for the Patriot cause. And I'll be getting to that part of the story in a couple of months. But 10crucialdays.org does an amazing job in covering these events. Also supporting the show is Mike Hager, also at the Privy Council level, and Chris Roy at the Standard Bearer level. Any supporters at either of these levels get a free magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. Patreon supporters also get early access to episodes and can read drafts of episodes that I haven't even recorded yet. If you can help support the show, go to patreon.com and search for the American Revolution Podcast. Also, another quick reminder, at the bottom of each blog episode, I've provided various book links that I've recommended. If you click on a link to Amazon, I get a small commission on anything you buy. You don't even have to buy the book I link to. If you just click on that link and then search for anything on Amazon that you were going to buy anyway, I get credit for that sale and I get a small commission. So it's a great way to support the show without actually spending any more money than you were going to already. So today's episode followed General Benedict Arnold's retreat after the Battle of Valcour Island. If anything, I think his retreat is more impressive than the battle itself. Sailing a fleet of sinking ships through the enemy fleet at night and then fighting a running battle that enables most of the crew to escape, if not the ships themselves, is really the stuff of legends. Now, no amount of bravery, of course, excuses Arnold's later treason. But before that happened, his combat leadership was just over the top. At the same time, British General Guy Carleton's failure even to make an attempt on Fort Ticonderoga after destroying the enemy fleet was far too conservative for most. You would think that he would at least have made an attempt to get the enemy to surrender before retreating. Carleton did not want to do anything, though, if the outcome was not certain. He was unwilling to take even small risks, and that would cost him his command the following spring. Of course, though, if you look at what his successor, General Burgoyne, did, he was far more aggressive and took a risky effort to capture Albany the following year, which led to disastrous results. So I guess the more conservative approach does sometimes have its merits. Whether Carleton could have taken Ticonderoga if he tried something is something we'll never know for sure because he didn't try. But this makes Arnold's defeat on the lake into a victory for the Continentals. It meant that they could hold on to Fort Ticonderoga until the following year. My book recommendation this week is from one of my favorite Revolutionary War authors. Nathaniel Philbrick published Valiant Ambition in 2016. His book follows the Revolution through the eyes of two generals, George Washington and Benedict Arnold. It shows just how crucial both men were to winning the war. Now, Arnold's treason is reason to obscure credit for all he did earlier, but it's hard to imagine the Continental Army's success without that early work. The book itself is not terribly long, especially for one that covers the whole war. It's a little over 300 pages of story, with another 100 pages of notes, index, and extras. As such, it does skip over some important events. In fact, it devotes only a few pages to today's topic, the Battle of Valcour Island. It is trying to cover the big picture of Washington and Arnold's impact on the war, rather than focusing on any one specific event. Philbrick, of course, is an award-winning history author. His latest book is another one about the Revolution. In the Hurricane's Eye, covers the victory at Yorktown. I haven't had a chance to read that one yet, but I am looking forward to it when I get a chance. His book Valiant Ambition is definitely worth a read to help understand the interplay between Washington and Arnold. My online recommendation this week is another podcast. The Based on a True Story podcast compares historical movies to what really happened. I recently did an interview with host Dan Lefebvre discussing how the show Turn on AMC compared to actual events involving the cult perspiring. I'm not sure if that episode will have been published by the time this episode publishes, but whenever it publishes, I will be sure to include a link on my website. In the meantime, if you search for Based on a True Story on your favorite podcast app, or go to basedonatruestorypodcast.com, you will find over 100 episodes on all sorts of interesting historical topics. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.